and welcome. I'm Dr. Michael Greger coming to you live from my treadmill. The last time you will see me in Seattle, I am moving to rural Virginia next month, and so you'll be able to check out my new pad, an actual little house, no more rentals. If you manage to catch my next webinar, which will be on May 13th on hair loss, mark your calendar, May 13th. But hey, a long time no see. It's been so long since my last webinar that I shaved off my beard and it grew it all back. Hashtag pandemic life. Normally you'd see me, I do interviews all the time and monthly Q&As, but I've been AWOL finishing up what is shaping up to be the most comprehensive book I have ever written, which is saying something. How Not to Age. Unfortunately, I'm over a deadline, scrambling to write the last few chapters. Still hoping to have it out by the end of the year, but no promises. Got to get back to writing, so let's get started. First, some quick housekeeping logistics. If at any time you run into technical difficulties, there are live chat Zoom staff standing by. Let me paste the link into the chat box for you. All right. If they're able to help, we also have Nutrition Facts staff standing by too. Though presumably if Zoom can't help, I don't know what they can do, but they can give you some emotional support. Here is that info, again, pasting it into the chat as well. All right, please reserve the Q&A button you see in the Zoom window there to ask content questions. Today's webinar is only an hour, but am reserving some time for Q&A at the end. So feel free to add your questions in the Q&A throughout the webinar. You don't have to wait till the end. And the Nutrition Facts team will compile them to be answered at the end. Don't have to worry about taking notes or anything. After the webinar is over, we are not only going to send you a full recording of it, but also a free link to download all the videos in high def, so you can see the videos in all their full resolution glory. All right, let me start with a video entitled "Fewer than 1 in 5,000 meat, sodium, and potassium recommended intakes." Play video 1. Let's do it. Oh, start at the beginning.
Worldwide, physical inactivity accounted for more than 10 million years of healthy life lost. But what we eat accounts for nearly 20 times that. Unhealthy diets shave hundreds of millions of disability-free years off of people's lives every year. What are the worst aspects of our diets? 4 out of the 5 of the deadliest dietary traps involve not eating enough of certain foods, not eating enough whole grains, not eating enough fruits, not eating enough nuts and seeds, and not eating enough vegetables. But our most fatal flaw is too much salt. That's on the order of 15 times deadlier than diets too high in soda, for example, just to keep things in perspective. There remains no single more effective public health action related to nutrition than the reduction of sodium in the diet. This is why national and international health organizations have called for warning labels on salt packets and salt shakers, with messages like, too much sodium in the diet causes high blood pressure and increases risk of stomach cancer, stroke, heart disease, and kidney disease. Limit your use. Salt also increases inflammation. For example, sodium intake is associated with increased disease activity in multiple sclerosis, an inflammatory autoimmune nerve condition, about 3 to 4 times the exacerbation rate in those with medium or high sodium intakes compared to those getting less than a teaspoon of salt total in a day. Just as you can see higher sodium levels in the tissues of those who suffer from lupus, another serious inflammatory autoimmune disease, you can correlate high sodium levels in the spinal cord of MS patients with the disease and decreased structural integrity. Where is sodium found, though? Really crappy food, so it's hard to know if increased salt intake is just a marker for a bad diet overall. But what we do know is that salt and high blood pressure are cause and effect. How? Because we have more than 100 randomized controlled trials demonstrating that if you cut down on added salt, your blood pressures fall, and the more you cut down, the better. Part of the mechanism may actually be the damage salt may do to your microbiome, the friendly flora in your gut. And no wonder. Our bodies evolved only to handle about 750 milligrams a day. The American Heart Association says we should stay under at least twice that, but we're eating more than 4 times what's natural. And it's only getting worse, increasing over the last decade. Anyone care to guess what percentage of Americans exceed the 1,500 milligram upper limit recommendation? 98.8%. And that was more than a decade ago. The vast majority of U.S. adults consume too much sodium, and at the same time, too little potassium, a mineral that lowers blood pressure. Less than 2% of U.S. adults consume the recommended daily minimum intake of potassium, so more than 98% of Americans eat potassium-deficient diets. This deficiency is even more striking when comparing our current intake with that of our ancestors, who consumed large amounts of dietary potassium. We evolved getting probably more than 10,000 milligrams a day. The recommendation is to get around at least half that, yet most of us don't even come anywhere close. Put the two guidelines together, and sodium and potassium goals are currently met by less than 0.015% of the U.S. population. So we're talking close to 99.99% noncompliance, as in only 1 in 6,000 Americans even hits the recommended guidelines. What about using potassium-based salt substitutes? Instead of using sodium chloride salt, why not shake on some potassium chloride? Seems a little too good to be true. Same salty taste, but you're reducing sodium while at the same time increasing your potassium intake? Is there a catch? Are potassium-based salt substitutes safe, effective? We'll find out next.
Next, as in right now. Though only 1 in 6,000 even meet the minimal guidelines, I bet there is a preponderance of those rare super beings right here, right now on this call. To recap, diet is humanity's #1 killer, which is great news. This is something we can do about it. And if there was only one thing about our diet to fix, it would be cutting down on salt. So what about those salt substitutes to get all the salty flavor without all the salty death? Let's find out in my next video. Are potassium chloride salt substitutes effective? All right, video 2, here we go.
Of all the terrible things about our diets, high dietary sodium intake, high salt intake, is the leading risk, estimated to be causing millions of deaths every year, killing millions mainly through adverse effects on blood pressure, an increased risk of stroke, heart attack, and kidney damage. Hypertension, high blood pressure, is still called the silent and invisible killer because it rarely causes symptoms, but is one of the most powerful independent predictors of some of our leading causes of death. We evolved consuming a diet very rich in potassium and low in sodium, but today this pattern has been completely reversed. This flip reflects a shift from traditional plant-based diets, high in potassium and low in sodium, a shift from fruits, greens, roots, and tubers, to salty processed foods stripped of potassium, which is considered a nutrient of public health concern, because 98% of the U.S. population doesn't even reach the recommended minimum daily intake of potassium, as I mentioned in the last video. And low potassium intake itself is implicated in high blood pressure and cardiovascular disease, yet few physicians actually think about proposing their patients eat more foods that are potassium-rich, like fruits and vegetables, to better control blood pressure, even though several meta-analyses have now confirmed that high potassium intake appears to reduce the risk of stroke. There's even a reduction in stroke risk independent of blood pressure effects, consistent with other protective effects of potassium, such as reducing clot formation, reducing hardening of the arteries, reducing the generation of free radicals. Higher sodium intake is associated with a 20% increased risk of dying prematurely, where higher potassium intake was associated with a 20% reduced risk of dying prematurely. Yeah, but sodium is found in crappy processed foods, while potassium is concentrated in healthy foods like beans and greens. So having low sodium intake and high potassium intake may just be a marker for a more healthful diet, more plant foods and less crap. How do we know sodium is cause and effect bad? Because randomized controlled trials show sodium reduction leads to blood pressure reduction. Just like there are randomized controlled trials showing that if you give people extra potassium, you can bring down their blood pressures as well. So what about using potassium chloride to salt your food rather than sodium chloride? That's what's found in these zero-sodium salt substitutes. Potassium chloride is a naturally occurring mineral salt, which is obtained the same way we get regular sodium salt. Since we get too much sodium and not enough potassium, this would seem to make potassium chloride a win-win solution. Now, whole, healthy plant foods would be the best way to increase potassium intake. Fruits and vegetables have all sorts of other good things in them besides potassium, but we have 10 studies now, randomized controlled trials showing that just swapping in some potassium chloride for regular salt can lead to significant reductions in blood pressure in people with hypertension, suggesting that salt substitutes may even help prevent hypertension as well. We know salt substitutes can lower blood pressure, but does it actually decrease the incidence of hypertension, and more importantly, disease endpoints like stroke and mortality? You don't know until you put it to the test. In a randomized controlled trial, households had their salt replaced with just a quarter potassium chloride. At that level, most people either can't tell the difference or even prefer the salt with the potassium mixed in. OK, but did it actually do any good? The use of even the quarter salt substitute was associated with cutting the risk of developing hypertension in half. OK, but what about actually following people out to see if there's any change in the risk of dying from cardiovascular disease? 5 kitchens in a veterans' retirement home were randomized into 2 groups for about 2.5 years, salting meals with regular salt or, unbeknownst to the cooks and the diners, a 50-50 blend of potassium chloride. Those in the half potassium group cut their risk of dying from cardiovascular disease by about 40%, and lived up to nearly a year longer. The life expectancy difference at age 70 was equivalent to that which would have naturally occurred in 14 years, meaning that just switching to half potassium salt appeared to effectively make people more than a decade younger when it came to risk of death. As we speak, there's a massive randomized controlled trial wrapping up in China, involving 600 villages and more than 20,000 people that'll give us an idea of just how low we can drop stroke risk with this strategy. China is perfect because up to 75% of their sodium intake comes from salt they add in the home kitchen or dining room, whereas most sodium in the American diet comes prepackaged in the meat and processed foods we buy, though certainly the food companies could switch over themselves. Why haven't they? And why haven't more people embraced these salt substitutes, if they work well and can taste just as good? We could be achieving the benefits of a high-potassium Paleolithic diet without the toxicity. So, is salt substitution ready for prime time or what? What about safety? Yes, there are convincing arguments about the benefits, but what about the risks? Like, the quote-unquote inclusion of potentially fatal salt substitutes in the food supply? Wait, what? We'll talk about the potential downsides next.
OK, let me just state again for the record, whole, healthy plant foods are the best way to increase potassium intake because of all the other wonderful things that they contain. But as a way to cut down on sodium intake, potassium chloride has literally been shown to be a lifesaver. So, should it be on everyone's dinner table? That brings us to the last video before I take your questions. Are potassium chloride salt substitutes safe? And if when I play videos, the Zoom just updated, if you're seeing video only on half of the screen and my Zoom profile pic on the other half, there's a little gray bar in the middle, and you can drag that over, and so you can see the video bigger. Or if you would rather see my new angel baby princess, the latest addition to the Greger family, you can put the gray bar the other way. It's all up to you. All right, but let's see this last video, and then we will do questions.
Based on how we evolve, the optimum dietary potassium intake likely greatly exceeds current and even recommended intakes. The problem is we replace many of the potassium-rich plant foods we used to stuff our faces with, like fruits, leafy greens, and other vegetables, including roots and tubers, with calorie-dense junk stripped not only of fiber, but also potassium, such as added fats and sugars. So in a traditional, largely plant-based diet, potassium content is high, and sodium content is low. But now, high blood pressure is the second leading cause of death in the world, killing more than 10 million people a year, second only to unhealthy diets, the #1 killer of humanity. We can improve both by eating more whole, healthy plant foods like beans and greens, which are packed with potassium, which lowers blood pressure. But since most of us are getting too much sodium along with too little potassium, what about using salt substitutes? After all, the most commonly used salt substitute is potassium chloride, so you'd be swapping out sodium for potassium. And it works. Based on a meta-analysis of more than a dozen randomized controlled trials, replacing sodium chloride with potassium chloride lowers blood pressure. And most of the trials involved just swapping out regular salt for less than 30% potassium chloride, and they still got results. And at less than 30%, most people can't even tell the difference between regular salt and the potassium salt. So it can taste exactly the same and drop your blood pressures? What's the catch? Potassium chloride is generally considered as safe by the FDA, with the only major concern for healthy people being that if you go completely 100% sodium-free and use straight potassium chloride like all these, it can taste kind of funny, adding a bitter or metallic taste. I've found that it depends on what I'm seasoning with it. It works perfectly well on some things, but makes other things completely inedible. When I learned about the sodium science and threw out my salt shaker for good, within a few weeks my palate totally changed and everything tasted fine without salt. Except pesto. For some reason, pesto without salt just never tasted like it used to me, so I tried the potassium chloride salt substitute, and it worked perfectly. I couldn't tell the difference at all, so I had the best of both worlds. Then I remembered how, as a kid, I used to put a tiny sprinkle of salt on watermelon, like they do in the South, to make it even sweeter, so I tried it with potassium salt, and almost gagged. So it's definitely not for everything. The reason healthy people don't have to worry about getting too much potassium is that our kidneys just pee out the excess. OK, but that's with potassium in food. What about supplements? No adverse effects have been shown for long-term intakes of potassium supplements as high as 3,000 milligrams a day. And in fact, blood levels of potassium are maintained in the normal range by healthy kidneys, even when potassium intake is increased to approximately 15,000 milligrams a day, which is no surprise, since we evolved eating so many healthy plant foods, so many fruits and vegetables, that the normal, natural potassium intake for the human species may be on the order of 15,000 milligrams a day. Basically, the normal range for potassium levels in the blood is between 3.5 and 5. And you start to worry when it starts creeping up towards 6. But give people potassium supplements, like all the salt substitution trials that have been giving study subjects an average of about 2,000 milligrams of potassium a day, and blood levels only go up 0.14, so they might go up from 4 to 4.14, not something that would push you into trouble. Now, there's a limit. If you have a quote-unquote massive banana eating habit, you could bump your potassium from normal to above 6, but that was evidently from years of not eating much of anything except up to 20 bananas a day. Eating 10 pounds of carrots every day is also probably not a good idea. That's like 75 carrots in one day, which you could only do with a juicer, which is what this person attempted to do as part of a quack cancer cure. What about overdoing salt substitutes? This report from the 1940s was on lithium poisoning from the use of salt substitutes. Why? Because lithium chloride was used as a salt substitute. Jesus! But what about potassium chloride, which is what's used today? There is one fatal case of someone who committed suicide by downing a little more than a tablespoon of a potassium chloride salt substitute. That doesn't seem like a lot, just a tablespoon? I mean, how can we keep that on the shelves if only a tablespoon will kill you? Well, even less than that of regular salt taken at once can kill you too. In fact, saltwater ingestion was evidently a traditional method of suicide in ancient China, though these days one may be more likely to die that way from abusive religious practices. Having said all that, there are a small number of the population who may run into problems, primarily those with severely impaired kidney function. That's why there's been such a reluctance to push potassium-based salt substitutes on a population level. If your kidneys can't regulate your potassium, then you can definitely run into a serious issue. And we're talking about folks with known kidney disease, diabetes, since diabetes can lead to kidney damage, severe heart failure, those on medications that impair potassium excretion, older adults, and individuals with adrenal insufficiency. If you aren't sure if you're at risk, ask your doctor about getting your kidney function tested. Ironically, potassium is so good at reducing deaths from high blood pressure, even among those with kidney disease, using potassium chloride salt substitutes would probably still save more lives, despite the risk. Traditional dietary recommendations to kidney patients limited the intake of fruits and vegetables because of their high potassium content. However, this paradigm is rapidly changing due to the multiple benefits derived from a fundamentally plant-based diet. A whole food plant-based diet may even ameliorate chronic kidney disease. There's increasing evidence that a whole food plant-based diet may offer benefits like slowing the progression of chronic kidney disease and delaying kidney failure. So the practice of restricting dietary potassium in kidney patients should really be reserved for patients with documented hyperkalemia, a potassium level of 6 or higher, because the key to halting the progression of chronic kidney disease may in fact lie in the produce aisle.
Speaking of the produce aisle, what is the best way to eat low sodium, high potassium? A whole food plant-based diet. And if adding the salty taste of potassium chloride is going to get you to stick to it and eat even more whole healthy foods, then I say go for it. However, if you are elderly or diabetic, do me a favor, first ask your physician about testing your kidney function. There are also medications like ACE inhibitors and certain diuretics or water pills that can impair potassium excretion, and so just talk to your doc first. All right, Q&A time. Let me just give the Nutrition Facts staff 5 minutes to compile all the most commonly asked questions, and then I will be right back. All right, we are back. Let's see what is on your list of questions. First question. I really miss the idea of fermented foods for my gut. How can we get the best of both? Is fermenting with KCl a possibility? Wow, that's a fantastic question. Just background first for people who are wondering what we're talking about. There are these probiotic bacteria on cabbage out in the fields, and when you take cabbage leaves and you dunk them in salt water, the salt prevents the growth of bad bacteria, whereas the good bacteria is relatively salt resistant. And so the good bacteria that's already present, you don't have to add any bacteria to make sauerkraut. The little lactic acid producing bacteria make for yummy sauerkraut, and you're set to go. The problem, of course, with sauerkraut is because you have to add sodium for food safety reasons to prevent bad bugs from growing, the sauerkraut is exceedingly high in salt. So now, if you really love sauerkraut, you can take sauerkraut and you can rinse it really well in a strainer or something, cut down some salt, but still probably really salty. So what a great question. Can I make sauerkraut with potassium chloride? I have no idea. It would depend on whether potassium chloride also has a bacteriostatic effect, also suppresses growth of bacteria and fungi that might pop up. And so you'd have to talk to like a fermentation expert. So that is a great question. I don't know if those bad bacteria, those spoilage bacteria, would be, if their growth would be suppressed by potassium chloride. But if you find out, let me know, because I'd love to make some sauerkraut myself. Okay, next question is, what is the risk of using potassium chloride salt substitutes for atrial fibrillation? I didn't run across anything on atrial fibrillation. Again, your potassium level shouldn't change because your kidneys just pee them out. So it shouldn't affect electrolyte levels. Next question, what is the absolute salt minimum to remain healthy? I've seen a video saying too little salt is a myth, but nonetheless, there must be some limit. How many days can one go more or less salt-free without problems? How can I tell whether I'm not getting enough sodium? Okay, you can go salt-free forever, like humanity did for millions of years, our ancestors who were landlocked and didn't have salt licks or KFC or salt shakers. That's because sodium is found in normal, natural, whole plant foods. Some plant foods are particularly salty, like celery is really salty. But all plant foods naturally have sodium in it, enough such that you don't have to add any salt to your diet. You will get, you only need a few hundred milligrams of sodium a day, which is like 10 times less than we're getting now, mostly because of processed food. And you don't even have to think about it. You will get it if you just eat enough whole, healthy plant foods. Okay, next, do all types of sodium, such as sodium bicarbonate, cause high blood pressure, or just the sodium in table salt? Unfortunately, all sodium, because as soon as that sodium bicarbonate gets in your body, it dissociates into sodium. And your body can't tell whether it used to be hitched up with chloride or with bicarb. And so, for example, I just made waffles the other day. I was shocked to find that you can buy a waffle maker for like $10. I was like, I'm gonna make some like Belgian waffle kind of things. Let me see if I can remember hold on, because I just made it. Let me tell you the recipe. 1 cup of buckwheat, and I sort of just get raw buckwheat and put it in a blender and blend it into flour. Really easy. You don't even need a fancy blender. And then a cup of unsweetened soy milk, some cinnamon if you want, some vanilla if you want, a teaspoon of baking powder, and is that it? Oh, and then of course I just put flax and everything. I just sprinkled some flax on. I think that's it. Anyway, they turned out wonderful. But the reason I'm telling you the story is because that is not a whole food plant-based meal. It was a treat to myself. I just did a deposition. I was expert witness in a trial. It was a long day. Good day though, but and I was wanting to treat, so I made waffles. But why is it not the whole healthy plant foods? Because I want to put lots of berries on top. It was delicious. Anyway, berries, frozen strawberries with chocolate balsamic. Perfect. 2 ingredients. That's it. That was the sauce. So good. Anyway, so of course, soy milk is not a whole food, even though it doesn't have any added sugar. But most critically, what made it had a red light ingredient, and that's baking soda. Why? Because baking soda has sodium in it. I used an aluminum-free baking soda, but it still has sodium in it. So, so that made a big chunk out of my 1,500 milligram minimum for that day. Anyway, sorry about that little side note, but all right, where are we? Okay, we did that one. Should very active people / athletes still avoid salt? Example, I exercise 2 hours a day. That's awesome. You just nailed your daily dozen, more than nailed it, requirement for exercise. I currently don't add salt, eat about 80% whole food plant-based. Fantastic, include about 100 grams of greens every day. That's not a lot of greens, but it's more than most people eat. Also 100 grams of fiber. Now we're talking. and eat about 4,000 calories to maintain that weight, but I still end up getting between 1,500 to 2,000 milligrams of salt every day. Should I reduce salt further or eat more salt? 1,500 is all you need, even if you're sweating like crazy. So I would keep your salt intake down. I would not add any more salt. And if you had 2,000 milligrams of salt a day and you are using any salt, I would cut back on the salt. Next question, does the ratio of potassium chloride matter? In their FAQ, New Salt, which is one of the brands, says they decide the combination of potassium and chloride to approximate the flavor of salt. I don't think they actually get to decide. I mean, potassium chloride is kind of the compound, the crystal in there, and it's 1-to-1. I don't think you can have more or less potassium chloride. I don't think the chemistry works that way. But I will note, and it may be the size of the crystal or who knows, but they do taste different from one another. So New Salt tastes different, even though it's just should be one ingredient. So if you don't like one, try another one. And they're different prices. They're all really quite expensive. And may turn you off, but because it's like a little thing for, I don't know, more money than you spend on normal salt. But of course, you're using so little, you can have the same little teeny container for months at a time. So anyway, so try one. If you don't like it, try the other one. So there must be some difference, maybe the size of the crystal, that just changes the flavor a little bit. But I would say the ratio, yeah, I don't think the ratio changes. Okay. What would I recommend if you want to get your iodine from a standalone iodine supplement? Okay, I'd rather not get it from sea vegetables that I recommend because the amount of iodine might have too much variability, may contain toxic metals. Is iodine included in potassium chloride? It is not. So potassium chloride is not iodized, or at least none that I've seen. And so you need to get iodine, regular reliable source of iodine someplace. I suggested whole food sources, but if you want to get it from a supplement, which is totally reasonable, particularly if you're pregnant, you want to make sure, because it's so important for the developing fetus. So I believe the RDA is 150 micrograms a day, and you can get that with a potassium, not potassium, with potassium iodide. So not instead of potassium chloride, it's a supplement called potassium iodide. I think that's actually what's used in like the nuclear war pills to protect your thyroid from nuclear blast radiation fallout. I assume they use potassium iodide. But anyway, yeah, you can get your iodine that way if you'd like as well. Okay. Oh, what about Himalayan pink salt or sea salt? Are they any less bad? Himalayan pink sea salt is just Himalayan pink salty death. It has a few little trace minerals in it, which change the color, but no, it's all bad. It's a marketing ploy. And sea salt. Sea salt's even worse than regular salt because most regular salt is actually iodized. So at least you're getting a little iodine because they add it to the salt supply, where sea salt is non-iodized. And all the salt they use in processed foods is not iodized. So if you're going to use real salt, I might as well get iodized salt. But of course, it's better to get iodine from natural sources. And look, iodine is found in the soil. So the fruits and vegetables you eat may very well have, you may get all the iodine you need, but, better safe than sorry. Okay, what about people with chronic kidney disease and risk of high potassium levels? You may have missed my last video. But yes, if you have confirmed hyperkalemia, potassium over 6, then absolutely you want to stay away from potassium salt substitutes because your body's obviously having trouble getting rid of potassium. Although, as an aside, I say at the end how it actually probably saved more lives, cutting down on sodium. But it's not. The solution is not, well, I'll just risk it by eating potassium salt substitutes. You would cut out both, obviously, to save for chronic kidney disease, or even better, eat a whole food plant-based diet, maybe reverse your chronic kidney failure, get healthy kidneys, and then do whatever you want. Okay, any brands you recommend for the salt substitute? So those are the 3 brands that I found. There's lots of other brands that are combinations, potassium chloride and sodium chloride. I would recommend against those. You don't want any, unless you really can't taste you can't stand the taste of straight potassium chloride. I found that I got more and more used to it, so I don't write it off at the beginning. But if, after giving it a few weeks and you're just like, I can't stand this stuff, then, and you're tempted to go back to regular salt, and neither is not an option for you, then yes, there are mixtures on the market like 50-50 sodium chloride, potassium chloride, or even like 30% potassium chloride, 70% sodium chloride. And in fact, one of the videos I just showed that at a certain ratio, no one can tell a difference. Like you can do taste tests and it just tastes like normal salt. And so you're getting 30% less sodium chloride for every shake, or 50% less. So definitely, I would consider those if you absolutely can't go with straight potassium chloride. But I've found that potassium chloride works for all my salty needs. There's just some dishes that having salty taste helps, and straight potassium chloride. And so I showed the 3 brands that I'm aware of that's straight potassium chloride, no sodium whatsoever. There may be others. I think I just did like an Amazon search. And the one that I like the best is the Morton's. I feel bad like supporting that horrible company which makes real salt. But yeah, I found that it tastes the best. Okay. Next question is coconut water a good way to get potassium? Coconut water does have lots of electrolytes and lactose. In fact, I did a video talking about using coconut water as a sports drink. So it was like a head-to-head test, water versus coconut water versus sports drink, I think, if I remember correctly. And coconut water came in last. Why? Because it gave people gastrointestinal distress for some reason, if I remember correctly. Anyway, check out that video if you're interested in coconut water. Okay, what are the potassium sodium guidelines for toddlers and children? Oh, that's a good question. So once we get really little kids, obviously has to change. I could look that up really quick. Let me look that up really quick. Sodium children IOM. All right, let's see what we got. Here we go. Oh, yeah. Well, for age 6, at least 6 and on, we're still down to 1,500. Okay, here we go. National Academies. National Academies of Sciences, the Institute of Medicine is who sets the RDA, the recommended daily allowances. Oh, why isn't this showing up? Oh, there it is. Okay. Oh, they just came out a new report in 2019. Well, that's exciting. Okay. Okay, so the sodium adequate intakes for those 14 and older, target is 1,500 milligrams a day. But for ages 9 through 13, 1,200 is the kind of RDA, quote unquote, and it's 1,000 for ages 4 through 8 and 800 for ages 1 through 3 and then 370 milligrams daily for infants 7 through 12, and 110 milligrams daily for infants 0 through 6. Though, of course, when we're talking about infancy, the sodium found in breast milk is all one needs without having to supplement anything. And there's kind of similar gradation in terms of potassium intakes. So I mean, there's shouldn't be, as long as your children have functioning kidneys, potassium chloride would be healthier than sodium chloride. It's hard to imagine what would be worse than sodium chloride, regular salt for kids. Next, do people on a good whole food plant-based diet need additional potassium? Well, you can figure it out. So 4,700 milligrams is the minimum recommended daily intake. Although, you know, maybe we used to get practically 3 times that. You can add it up, see how you're doing. Some foods have more potassium than others. The food with the highest potassium, not bananas. Remember, I did some funny video where it's like bananas came in at like number 50 or something, or 1,000, or I forget. It was something like, whoa, way down the list. Number 1, I believe, was beet greens, and number 2 were some kind of beans. So beans and greens, basically, those are the potassium superstars, but all whole, you know, plant foods have lots of potassium. Even white potatoes, lots of potassium. All right. Ooh, my granola is done. That's exciting. Okay. Does miso cause high blood pressure? We don't have interventional studies, but we do have observational data showing that men, I believe it was only men who ate huge amounts of miso, like 3 bowls of miso soup a day, did not have higher blood pressure than those eating significantly less. If I remember correctly, I have a video about this. Just type in miso on NutritionFacts.org, and they did not have a higher blood pressure, and they did not appear to have higher rates of stomach cancer either, which are the 2 things we're particularly concerned about with sodium consumption, although sodium does other bad things. So it does not seem to be, and so that's why in my cookbooks, like the How Not to Diet cookbook, the How Not to Diet cookbooks, no salt, oil, or sugar is in any of the recipes, or every single food is a green light food, whole plant food. And so that's how we make things salty in the cookbook, is by adding miso, usually white mild miso. Something, in fact, my favorite dressing, which I talk about in How Not to Die, and actually just used the last of it that my last batch, uses a miso. So yeah, I love it. Wonderful. Okay. How are we doing? We're doing okay. Can potassium chloride be added to saline nasal sprays? Huh. Well, so a saline is salt water. It's like regular salt, sodium chloride and water. And so you wouldn't want to add it to saline. I guess the question is, could you make a saline out of potassium chloride and would have the same kind of buffering effect in terms of osmolarity to not be irritating like regular water? I don't think there's it's necessary. I don't think people are absorbing a lot of sodium from nasal sprays. I mean, you're not supposed to swallow it. You know, they have these, you you squirt them up your nose, and you have stuffed nose or whatever. But then you're supposed to spit it out. So yeah, so spit it out. Don't swallow it. So that should be fine. Yeah, I can't imagine you're actually eating a lot of salt by doing that. I mean, I'm sure a little trickles down, but I think too little. Okay, the author of the book, The Salt Fix, never heard of it, says that a low salt diet causes a reduced sex drive and increased erectile dysfunction. Is that true? That I cannot imagine to be true. Our ancestors lasted for millions of years and reproduced for millions of years with on low salt diets, because that's all there was. And so I can't imagine it would reduce sex drive. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, biologically, we're meant to eat 10 times less salt than we do. And so no wonder salt is such a problem. And in fact, the erectile dysfunction, part of erectile dysfunction is a vascular component, and salt impairs nitric oxide production, and therefore impairs your ability of your arteries to relax normally, letting blood flow to all the organs in our body. So if anything, I think it would be the reverse. But if that author cites some study or something, let me know, and I'd be happy to look at the study. What about sodium-free baking powder? What about sodium-free baking powder? Some people mention it exists. Would that be okay for baking? I had no idea. I thought you needed sodium in baking powder. It doesn't work. That's awesome. I'm totally going to look it up. If anyone knows a preferred brand or whatever, I mean, that is cool. I'm sure I looked for that and couldn't find it. So maybe it's some new thing. That's awesome, because I love my waffles. Okay, some have suggested it's the potassium to sodium ratio. That's important for blood pressure control. Do I agree? Independent of sodium intake, potassium is good for you. Independent of potassium intake, sodium is bad for you. But you can imagine how people would come up with this kind of sodium potassium ratio, because they tend to have kind of opposite effects. So potassium lowers your blood pressure, sodium increases your blood pressure. So it's like, well, maybe you just got to get the balance right. But a high sodium diet is bad regardless of how much potassium you have. So it's not like a way you can get away with eating a lot of salt, because like, I'll just eat a whole bunch of beet greens to compensate. Doesn't work that way. Next question. Will I use potassium chloride in my next cookbook? Well, not really a green light food. So I want every ingredient of every recipe to be a whole plant food. And it gets silly, right? Because instead of saying lemon juice, I say, blended lemon, like as if like the little shred of fiber is going to make a difference in a quarter teaspoon of lemon juice, right? But it's just like on principle. I want everything. I want every ingredient, not just every recipe to be healthy, including all the desserts, but every ingredient of every single recipe to be the maximum health. So potassium chloride is obviously not a whole food, it's not a food as grown. And so no, I will not. But if you want to sprinkle some on top of some awesome new recipe we come up with, go for it. And there will be a How Not to Age cookbook, which will be out December 2023, I believe. Okay. Do I see potassium salt getting widespread use in the foreseeable future, including in processed foods? Wouldn't that be a dream? That would be awesome. I mean, that would save a lot of lives. One of the sticking points is that potassium chloride sounds very chemical. And so, people look at a list of ingredients like potassium chloride. What is that weird sounding ingredient? Whereas the salt industry can add salt, and they don't call it sodium chloride, they call it salt. And people are like, oh, I know what salt is. This doesn't sound like a weird chemical ingredient. And so the potassium chloride industry has petitioned the FDA to let them call it potassium salt on the label. So instead of potassium chloride, we just say potassium salt. And I think that would make it more palatable to people. It's the exact same thing. Although, I mean, it would kind of, I guess, confuse people if they're like, oh, I heard salt was bad for me, but there isn't actually any salt, right? There's no sodium. Anyway, but they think that'll help with it. And I don't think the FDA has ruled on that. I remember them asking me to sign some petition. And I was happy to do so because I think potassium chloride expansion would be good for public health. So I don't know if FDA says that's okay, that companies would be more likely to use it. I certainly hope they would. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Oh yeah, that's great. Okay, what foods are yucky with potassium chloride besides watermelon? Oh, how is it on popcorn? Oh, it's awesome on popcorn. Literally yesterday, yesterday I broke my don't eat after 7 p.m. rule. Don't eat after it gets dark, because I was just hankering for popcorn out of the blue. And oh my God, it's perfect on popcorn. Like, can't tell the difference on popcorn. My latest, so I used to like spritz malt vinegar on popcorn to make the like nutritional yeast and everything stick. But now I've just been using straight Tabasco. I just squirt Tabasco on it. For people who really like Tabasco, it's a really nice flavor with the corn. And then I guess, Tabasco is actually a really low salt, low sodium hot sauce. One of the lowest on the market, which is one of the reasons I love it so much. It would probably have enough sodium though that you wouldn't need extra salty taste. But I threw in some nutritional yeast, some little smoked paprika, and some potassium chloride. And it was delicious. Okay. Next, next question was, what chocolate balsamic brand do I use? I used to use, I still do for the chocolate. I don't remember the name. It was the one that the Esselstyns, I think the Esselstyns must have had some kind of like relationship with this company, because they would show up at they would have a booth at like their conferences and stuff. And that's where I first tried it. And so I ordered through them and I loved it. And so I never looked anywhere else. Maybe it's better somewhere else. I have no idea, but it's just, that's how I got introduced to it. So I bet if you type in Esselstyn, if you can spell it, and vinegar, it would pop up. I don't know if they still have a relationship with them or not, but anyway, they have really wonderful balsamics. Chef AJ has a relationship with a California balsamics, I think that's the name, company. I don't think they have a chocolate, but they do have a habanero one that is really tasty. But I think anyway, yeah, unfortunately I have to leave vinegars here because I'm afraid if I ship them, they're gonna break open and it'd be like really a mess. And so I don't know if anyone's in Seattle that wants some balsamic vinegar, you're welcome to free balsamic vinegar. Okay. And next question was, how do we measure or test our sodium levels? Oh, I guess that'll be our last question since we're 2 minutes to end. I wonder if there's some kind of like pH strip kind of thing you can dip your pee in. I do not know. I mean, normally we as physicians, you get tested, which called getting chemistries or whatever, and it's just getting all your electrolytes, and your sodium will pop up, your potassium will pop up. But no need to test your sodium level. I mean, sodium levels is really more concerned with overhydration, drink too much water or too much sports drink, wash sodium out of your brain, that can run you into real problems. And your sodium level is really not a reflection of how much salt you eat, just like your potassium levels really aren't a reflection on how much potassium you eat. It's how much you excrete. It's how good are your kidneys at just getting rid of it. And so, yeah. Okay, we have 1 minute left here. Remember, next webinar, May 13th. Make sure you're signed up in NutritionFacts.org email newsletter for registration details. Though if you got the one for this webinar, you probably get the one for next. Thanks everyone for joining me today. Wish me luck finishing the book. Stay safe, be kind, get vaccinated, and eat your vegetables. Maybe with a little potassium chloride on top.